There's a room just outside the Forbidden City where 10-year-old boys are screaming. The smell is blood and hot peppers. A surgeon holds a curved knife. Your father sold everything to bring you here. The plow, the ox, even his winter coat. Your mother couldn't watch. She stayed home, weeping. The surgeon asks you one final question. Are you willing? You're 10. You don't understand what comes next. You just know your family is starving, and this is the only way out. You nod. The knife comes down. Everything that makes you a boy is gone in a single cut. If you survive, and many don't, you'll enter the Forbidden City as a eunuch. Castrated, permanently altered, unable ever to have children. Marked forever by this moment. Your family hopes you'll eat regularly, maybe gain security, maybe, if luck holds, wealth. But here's what they don't know. Here's what nobody tells you about eunuchs. Here's the part that will change everything you thought you understood about power in imperial China. The boys who survived that room, the ones who were mutilated and marked as less than human, some of them became the most powerful people in the entire Chinese empire. They toppled dynasties. They commanded fleets that sailed to Africa. They accumulated wealth that would make modern billionaires look poor. One eunuch was so powerful that while emperors were called 10,000 years, he was called 9,000 years, and government officials begged to be adopted as his sons. The system designed to render them powerless created the most dangerous men in Chinese history. And here's the twist that makes this story so devastating. The irony that will haunt you as we go deeper. The Chinese emperors created the eunuch system to protect themselves, to ensure their bloodlines stayed pure, to eliminate threats from ambitious men who might seduce their wives or murder them for the throne. But by the end, and we will get to the end, you'll see that the emperors accomplished the exact opposite. They created their own destroyers. The very system meant to make them safe made them vulnerable. The servants who were supposed to be harmless became the most dangerous people in the empire. 2,000 years, millions of castrated men, and the entire time, the system was working against those it was meant to protect. Tonight, we're stepping through the scarlet gates of the Forbidden City into the inner courtyards where only eunuchs could remain after dark. We're going to follow boys from that operating room through decades of service, suffering, and sometimes spectacular power. We're going to understand what it cost them, what they gained, and what it reveals about humans when we're desperate enough to trade anything for survival. This is the story you were never told. The story behind the crimson walls. The story that explains how victims became victimizers, how the powerless seized absolute power, and how the mightiest empire on earth was undone by the very men it had castrated to keep itself safe. Let's begin where every eunuch's story began, with the knife, the blood, and a choice that was never really a choice at all. Part 1. The choice that changed everything. The year is 1620, and in a small village in Hebei province, a boy named Wei Zhongxian is drowning in gambling debts. He's 21 years old, married and completely broke. The debt collectors are circling. There are whispers about debtor's prison, about his wife being sold to pay what he owes. Wei Zhongxian has heard stories about the Forbidden City in Beijing, about the eunuchs who serve the emperor, about the wealth they accumulate, the power they wield. He's heard that some eunuchs live like princes, that they own mansions, that they control access to the Son of Heaven himself. He's also heard about the operation. Wei Zhongxian makes his decision. He'll later take a new name in the palace, Wei Zhongxian, and he'll become the most powerful and feared eunuch in Chinese history. a man who will effectively rule China for 7 years, who will have hundreds of officials executed, who will be worshipped in temples built in his honor. But right now, in 1620, he's just a desperate man walking toward a room that smells of blood and hot peppers, about to make a choice that can never be undone. Wei Xi's story was unusual only in how it ended. The beginning, the choice, the desperation. That was common. That was the story of thousands upon thousands of boys and men across Chinese history. From the establishment of the practice during the Han Dynasty around 146 AD, continuing through the Tang, Song, Yuan, Ming, and Qing dynasties, until its final abolition in 1924, somewhere between hundreds of thousands and millions of males underwent castration to enter imperial service. The numbers swelled and receded like tides. During the Ming dynasty, particularly by 1644, the number of eunuchs in the Forbidden City alone may have reached 70,000. When the Qing dynasty took power, determined to limit eunuch influence after seeing what happened to the Ming, they reduced the number drastically. By the early 20th century, around 2,000 eunuchs remained, but whether there were 2,000 or 70,000, each one had made the same impossible calculation. Let's understand what drove that calculation. Let's understand the world outside the Forbidden City's walls, the world that made castration seem like an opportunity rather than a mutilation. China, for most of its imperial history, was a place of staggering inequality. The emperor and the aristocracy lived in unimaginable luxury. The scholar officials who passed the brutal imperial examinations enjoyed status, wealth, and power. Below them stretched an enormous population of farmers, laborers, and merchants who often lived on the edge of starvation. Floods, droughts, wars, and famines were common. The average family survived on rice and vegetables, with meat a rare luxury. Sons, especially third or fourth or fifth sons, with no hope of inheriting the small family plot, faced a future of back-breaking labor for barely enough food to survive. Then there were the orphans, the children of executed criminals, the boys captured in border wars, the sons of families so poor that another mouth to feed meant everyone starving. For these boys, for these families, the Forbidden City represented something impossible: security. A eunuch received a salary, small but steady, 2 to 4 taels of silver each month for most positions, up to 12 taels for the highest ranks. More importantly, eunuchs received food, rice rations, clothing allowances, and coal in winter. They were housed in the palace. They would never starve. They would never freeze. And if a eunuch was clever, if he made the right alliances, if he positioned himself near the emperor or the emperor's favorite concubines, he might become rich, very rich, because eunuchs controlled access. Everything that entered the palace, every bolt of silk, every basket of fruit, every memorial from provincial officials, passed through eunuchs' hands. And eunuchs expected a cut. Low-ranking eunuchs took portions of food deliveries. High-ranking eunuchs accepted bribes from officials desperate for imperial audiences. The most powerful eunuchs skimmed from imperial revenues, controlled secret police forces, and accumulated fortunes that would make modern billionaires envious. The eunuch Liu Jin, who dominated the early 16th century Ming court for just 4 years before his execution in 1510, had accumulated wealth estimated at £15 million of gold. £15 million. Even accounting for historical measurement differences, we're talking about staggering, almost incomprehensible wealth. So when a poor family in Hebei, or Shandong, or Yunnan heard these stories, when they looked at their sons and saw only a future of poverty, hunger, and early death, castration began to seem like a trade worth making. Sacrifice the possibility of having children, sacrifice sexual function, sacrifice what Confucian philosophy considered the sacred wholeness of the body. but gain security, status, and perhaps, if fortune smiled, wealth and power beyond imagination. Parents made this choice for their sons. Young boys, some as young as 8 or 9, were brought to the castrators. The families received a payment, a few silver pieces, compensation for donating their child to imperial service. The child had little say. He was too young to understand what he was losing, too young to imagine what his life might have been. But some men, like Wei Zhongxian, made the choice themselves as adults. They walked into the castrator's room fully aware of what they were giving up. They chose it anyway, because the alternative, prison, starvation, disgrace, seemed worse, or because the lure of power was too strong to resist. And there was one other source of eunuchs, one we should not forget. Castration was also a punishment. Under ancient Chinese penal law, castration was one of the 5 punishments reserved for serious crimes. The famous historian Sima Qian, who wrote the fundamental historical records of China, was castrated by order of Emperor Wu of Han in 99 BC as punishment for defending a defeated general. Sima Qian had the option of death or castration. He chose castration, and then spent the rest of his life writing the history that would preserve his name for millennia. In his letters, he described the shame, the humiliation, the way people looked at him differently afterward. But he also described his determination to make his survival mean something. Eunuchs created by punishment, by poverty, by family desperation, by adult choice, all paths led to the same place, to a small room, usually located just outside the Forbidden City's walls, where specialized surgeons waited with their knives. The question every potential eunuch faced was simple and terrible. Is survival worth this price? Most who arrived at that room, whether carried by their parents or walking on their own adult legs, decided yes. Because once you were inside that room, once you were lying on the table with men holding you down, once you heard the final question, the surgeon always asked, "Are you willing?" There was no good answer except yes. Let's follow one of these boys into that room. Let's understand what happened next. Part 2. The room where boys became eunuchs. The procedure happened in special buildings, sometimes called factories or silkworm rooms. The name silkworm room came from the practice of raising silkworms in closed, heated spaces to speed their growth. Castration rooms were similarly enclosed and heated, officially to promote faster healing, perhaps also to muffle the screams. By the Qing dynasty, which ruled from 1644 to 1912, castration had become a specialized trade passed down through families. These castration guilds, known as Daozijiang, maintained expertise refined over generations. The most famous castration families operated buildings near the Forbidden City, where the operations took place. The surgeons charged a fee, typically 6 silver taels, which many poor families borrowed against their sons' future salaries. The timing mattered. Operations were usually performed in spring or early summer, avoiding extreme heat that promoted infection or extreme cold that slowed healing. The candidate, whether a 10-year-old boy or an adult man, was brought into the room. Often family members were present, though they would step out during the procedure itself. The surgeon would ask questions, giving the candidate final chances to back out. The questions were ritual but also practical. Are you willing to cleanse it? Do you understand there is no going back? Do you know you will die without sons? These weren't gentle inquiries. They were hammering home the irreversibility of what was about to happen. If the candidate showed hesitation, if he started crying or trying to leave, the surgeon was supposed to stop. Coerced castrations could lead to legal trouble, and besides, the palace had found that unwilling eunuchs made unreliable servants. But most candidates, having come this far, having made this choice, would steel themselves and give consent. Then came the preparation. The candidate was stripped naked. His thighs and abdomen were bound tightly with cloth to restrict blood flow to the genital area. Several strong men, usually assistants to the surgeon, would then hold the candidate down on a table or special chair. Some accounts describe a chair with a hole in the seat, allowing the genitals to hang through for easier access. The genitals were washed, often with water infused with peppers. Hot pepper water served as both a disinfectant and a numbing agent, though calling it effective anesthesia would be generous. Some sources mention that this was the only pain relief provided. Imagine it, the burning sensation of pepper water on your most sensitive areas as your body's last warning of what's coming. Then the surgeon took up his knife. The blade was typically a small, curved knife, similar to those used by carpenters, sharpened to a razor edge, and sterilized by being heated in fire until it glowed. And then came the cut. Chinese castration was complete and total. Unlike the Ottoman practice, which removed only the testicles, Chinese castrators removed everything, both testicles and the entire penis, in a single cut. Some sources describe it as a sweeping motion, others as a series of rapid cuts, but the result was the same: total emasculation. The pain was indescribable. Many candidates passed out immediately. Others screamed until their voices gave out. The assistant's job was to hold the thrashing body still enough that the surgeon could complete the operation cleanly. Because precision mattered. If too little was removed, if any erectile tissue remained, the candidate would not pass the later inspection and would not be allowed into the palace. If the cut went too deep, severing major blood vessels, the candidate could bleed to death on the table. The mortality rate is difficult to determine precisely from historical records, but most scholars estimate that 10 to 30% of candidates died from the operation. Some from shock during the procedure itself, others from blood loss in the hours afterward, still others from infection during the long recovery period. For those who survived the operation itself, the immediate aftermath was almost as dangerous. The wound was immediately treated with a mixture of herbs designed to promote clotting and prevent infection. The exact composition of these herbal pastes was a trade secret of castration families, refined over generations. Then came a critical step. A small plug or tube, usually made from a quill or a piece of wood, was inserted into the urethra to keep it open while the wound healed. If the urethra sealed shut, the candidate would be unable to urinate and would die an agonizing death from kidney failure within days. This plug remained in place for 3 days. During those 3 days, the candidate was not allowed to drink water, not a drop. This was to minimize urine production while the wound was most vulnerable. Imagine the thirst, the desperate craving for water while lying in agony from genital mutilation. For 3 days. On the 3rd day, the plug was removed. If urine flowed out normally, the operation was considered a success. If urine didn't flow, or if it leaked from the wound rather than the urethra, the candidate was doomed. Many who had survived the initial operation died at this moment. But if the candidate survived this test, if urine flowed properly, the worst danger had passed. Not the worst pain, not the worst recovery, but the most immediately life-threatening danger. The candidate was now on the path to becoming a eunuch. The recovery period lasted about 100 days. During this time, the candidate remained in the castration facility or in a designated recovery area. He could not wear clothes for the first month. The wound needed to be exposed to air to heal properly, and any friction from fabric could cause complications. Imagine spending a month naked, unable to move much, the wound raw and painful, while your body began to change in ways you couldn't yet fully understand. The wound was cleaned daily, fresh herbal dressings applied. Gradually, scar tissue formed. The area where genitals had been became smooth scar tissue with only a small opening for urination. The surgeon would check the healing regularly, looking for signs of infection, redness, swelling, pus, fever. If infection set in, there was little that could be done with pre-modern medicine. Most infected candidates died. Those who survived the full recovery period were left with permanent physical changes beyond the obvious absence of genitals. Because they had lost their testicles, they no longer produced testosterone. This affected their bodies in multiple ways. Their voices, if castrated before puberty, would never deepen. Even men castrated after puberty experienced voice changes, often becoming higher pitched. They developed less muscle mass, their body fat redistributed to a more feminine pattern, and many developed slight breast tissue. Some eunuchs, especially those castrated very young, grew quite tall because the growth plates in their bones never fully closed as they normally would under testosterone's influence. And then there was the urine problem. The complete removal of the penis and the restructuring of the urethral opening left many eunuchs with limited control over urination. Many eunuchs experienced incontinence throughout their lives. They wet themselves. They wet their beds. The smell of urine clung to them constantly. This was so common that "stinking eunuch" became a vulgar Chinese expression. People claimed they could smell a eunuch from far away. The Forbidden City, filled with thousands of eunuchs, was noted by visitors as having a pervasive smell of urine. Imagine living with that. Not just the physical discomfort of incontinence, not just the constant need to clean yourself and your clothes, but the social stigma. Everyone could smell what you were. Your castration was not just visible in your high voice, your smooth face, your distinctive gait. It was a smell that announced you before you entered a room. But the candidates who survived the operation, who recovered over those 100 days, who learned to manage their new bodies, they had cleared the first barrier. They were now eunuchs. Now came the final test before entering the Forbidden City. They had to prove it. Because here's something most people don't know about the eunuch system, something that reveals both its thoroughness and its paranoia. Castration could be faked. Some desperate men tried to fool the palace inspectors, hoping to gain the benefits of eunuch status without actually undergoing the operation. This had disastrous implications for the Forbidden City's primary function, ensuring that every child born to the emperor's concubines was actually fathered by the emperor. So the palace required proof. Regular inspections. And for these inspections, eunuchs needed their bao. The bao translates as precious or treasure. It referred to the removed genitals. After the operation, the surgeon would take the severed penis and testicles, wash them, and seal them in a small container, or wrap them in cloth. This package was then returned to the eunuch or his family. The eunuch was required to keep his bao for his entire life. Why? Because Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucian thought, held that the body received from one's parents should remain complete and intact. Desecration of the body was a serious offense, and a body that was not whole could not properly enter the afterlife or be reunited with ancestors. For eunuchs, this created a spiritual crisis. They had violated the fundamental principle of bodily integrity. The only solution was to preserve the removed parts and be buried with them, hoping that in death, the body could be made whole again. But the bao served a more immediately practical purpose. Before a eunuch could enter the Forbidden City, before he could be promoted to any significant position, he had to present his bao for inspection. Officials would examine the preserved genitals to verify that the castration was complete. Both testicles, the entire penis. Only then would the eunuch be certified as safe to serve in the inner court. This created a bizarre economy. Eunuchs had to guard their bao carefully. Some kept them in their living quarters, stored on high shelves, treated with the utmost care. But disasters happened. Fires destroyed them. Thieves stole them. Careless eunuchs lost them. When a eunuch lost his bao, he faced disaster. He could not advance in rank. He could not prove his status. Desperate eunuchs would pay enormous sums to purchase or rent someone else's bao for inspections. Some eunuchs made side businesses selling or renting their preserved genitals. The price of a bao could be substantial, sometimes more than a year's salary. One can hardly imagine a more grotesque or tragicomic situation. Men carrying little bags containing their own severed genitals, carefully preserved for decades, presenting them for official inspection like strange and horrible identification documents. But this was the reality of the eunuch system. This was what it meant to trade your manhood for entrance into the Forbidden City. You kept your manhood in a bag. You presented it on demand to prove you no longer had it. And with that proof, with the scars healed and the bao secured, a eunuch was ready to pass through the gates of the Forbidden City and into a world unlike any other on earth. A world of crimson walls and golden roofs, of emperors and concubines, of ceremony and silence, of unimaginable luxury and brutal hierarchy. A world that only eunuchs could fully inhabit. Let's step through those gates now. Let's see what awaited them inside. Part 3. The Forbidden City. A world within walls. The Forbidden City was built during the Ming dynasty under the Yongle Emperor. Construction began in 1406 and was completed in 1420. Over 1 million workers labored to create this palace complex that would serve as the political and ceremonial center of China for nearly 500 years, until the last emperor was expelled in 1924. The complex was massive, nearly 1,000 buildings, almost 10,000 rooms, surrounded by walls over 30 feet high and a moat 200 feet wide. The whole complex covered about 180 acres in the heart of Beijing. It was called the Forbidden City, or, in Chinese, Zijincheng, because entry was strictly controlled. Common people were not allowed to even look at it. When passing by, they had to avert their eyes. To look directly at the imperial palace could be interpreted as treason. The palace was divided into 2 main sections, the outer court and the inner court. The outer court, in the southern half, was where the emperor conducted official business. It housed the great ceremonial halls, including the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where the emperor held audiences, issued edicts, and performed major state rituals. Officials, ministers, generals, all the men who ran the Chinese bureaucracy could enter the outer court during the day, though they had to leave by nightfall. But the inner court, the northern half, was different. The inner court was the emperor's private realm. This was where the emperor lived, where his family resided, where his concubines were housed in their various palaces and courtyards. This was the residential section, the intimate section, the section where the emperor could theoretically relax away from the ceremonial demands of his role. And into this space, no intact man could enter except the emperor himself. Not his brothers, not his sons once they reached a certain age, not his generals, no matter how trusted, not his officials, no matter how senior, not even his father, if his father still lived. The inner court was sealed against all male intrusion except one, the emperor. Well, except for the eunuchs. Eunuchs were the only males who could enter and remain in the inner court. They could be there day and night. They could enter the concubines' chambers, the empress's quarters, the princes' and princesses' rooms. They attended the emperor during his most private moments, bathing, dressing, sleeping, eating. They were there at births and deaths. They heard conversations never meant for outside ears. They witnessed everything. Why? Because the fundamental anxiety of any hereditary monarchy is legitimacy. The emperor needed to produce male heirs, preferably many male heirs, to ensure the dynasty's continuation. But those heirs had to be his own children. If there was any doubt about paternity, the entire system collapsed. A false heir would be performing the ancestral rites for someone who wasn't actually his ancestor, throwing the cosmic order into chaos according to Chinese religious philosophy. A false heir might be controlled by his real father's family, creating a shadow dynasty within the palace. So the emperor maintained large harems of concubines to ensure multiple sons. During the Ming dynasty, the emperor might have dozens or even hundreds of concubines. The Qing emperors were slightly more restrained, but still maintained substantial harems. With infant mortality rates high, multiple children were necessary to ensure some would survive to adulthood. But a harem full of women living in close quarters needed servants. They needed food brought, clothing washed, chambers cleaned, hair dressed, messages carried. They needed companionship, entertainment, supervision. Someone had to manage all these daily details. It couldn't be done by women alone. There were too many tasks, too much coordination required. It also couldn't be done by intact men. Not if you wanted to guarantee that every child born in the inner court was the emperor's. So the solution was eunuchs, men whose castration theoretically made them incapable of sexual intercourse, who posed no threat to the purity of the imperial bloodline, who could move through the women's quarters without arousing suspicion or desire. This is where the common misconception about eunuchs begins. Many people imagine that eunuchs were simply guardians of the harem, passive watchdogs making sure the women stayed chaste. But this is a misunderstanding influenced by Western, particularly Judeo-Christian, interpretations. The reality was more complex. First, eunuchs weren't imported into China from cultures where harem guards were common. The Chinese developed their own eunuch system for their own reasons, primarily related to Confucian philosophy about lineage and imperial legitimacy. Second, while eunuchs were presumed to be incapable of sexual intercourse, this wasn't entirely true. Men castrated after puberty often retained some sexual function. They could still achieve erections, though they couldn't produce semen or father children. And the emotional and psychological dimensions of sexuality don't disappear with castration. There are historical accounts of eunuchs having sexual relationships with concubines and palace women, though these relationships couldn't produce children. One particularly famous scandal involved a man named Lao Ai, who disguised himself as a eunuch during the Qin dynasty to gain access to the Queen Mother. He fathered 2 children with her before the deception was discovered. Both he and his sons were executed. But such cases were rare, mostly because the inspections were rigorous and the punishment for attempted deception was death. The real role of eunuchs in the inner court wasn't to prevent sex through physical coercion, but to make sex between concubines and intact men logistically impossible. There simply were no other men around. The eunuchs were there, but the eunuchs couldn't father children. So the Forbidden City's structure, the walls, the gates, the division into outer and inner courts, the strict rules about who could be where and when, all of this created a space where the emperor was the only intact male who could remain overnight. Where thousands of women lived in a carefully ordered hierarchy, attended by thousands of eunuchs, and the emperor moved between them as the single source of legitimate offspring. From the eunuch's perspective, they inhabited a strange middle ground. They were men, but not men. They had male pronouns, male names, men's legal status, but they lived among women, served women, spent their days in women's quarters attending to women's needs. They dressed in clothing that was distinctly eunuch clothing, different from both male officials' robes and women's garments. They moved through spaces that other men couldn't enter, saw things other men never saw, and yet they were never quite part of the women's world either. Physically, the inner court was a labyrinth of courtyards and buildings. The main palaces had names that reflected the Confucian ideals the emperor was supposed to embody: the Palace of Heavenly Purity, the Hall of Mental Cultivation, the Palace of Earthly Tranquility. Surrounding these main structures were numerous smaller buildings, pavilions, gardens, and courtyards where concubines of various ranks resided. The hierarchy of concubines was elaborate. At the top was the empress, the emperor's principal wife. Below her were various ranks of consorts and concubines, each with specific titles and privileges. Lower-ranking concubines might share quarters, while higher-ranking ones had their own palaces with their own staff of eunuchs and maids. And then there were the children, princes and princesses born to the emperor and his various women. They lived in the inner court with their mothers until the princes reached a certain age and were moved to their own residences. These children were served by eunuchs from infancy. A young prince's first companions were often the eunuchs assigned to care for him. They played together, studied together in some cases, and bonds formed. This is crucial to understanding how eunuchs gained power. A eunuch who served a prince from childhood, who was the prince's playmate and confidant, would maintain that relationship when the prince became emperor. The new emperor trusted these childhood companion eunuchs in ways he could never trust ministers and officials he barely knew, and that trust could translate into enormous power. This happened repeatedly throughout Chinese history. Wei Zhongxian, the powerful Ming eunuch we mentioned earlier, gained his position by serving the young man who became the Tianqi emperor. When the prince ascended the throne at age 15, Wei Zhongxian was one of the few people he trusted. Within a few years, Wei Zhongxian effectively ruled China. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For most eunuchs entering the Forbidden City for the first time, power was unimaginable. They were at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy. New eunuchs, fresh from their recovery, were assigned to the most menial tasks in the most insignificant locations. They had to prove themselves reliable, competent, and loyal before they could hope for any advancement. The number of eunuchs in the Forbidden City varied dramatically by dynasty and by period. During the Ming dynasty, the number grew almost out of control. By 1644, there may have been as many as 70,000 eunuchs attached to the palace and imperial government. This was partly because Ming emperors, particularly in the later dynasty, increasingly relied on eunuchs rather than on the scholar-official bureaucracy. Eunuchs were seen as personally loyal to the emperor in ways that officials, who had their own intellectual and political allegiances, were not. When the Qing dynasty came to power in 1644, they were determined to avoid the Ming's mistakes. They viewed the Ming's fall as partly due to eunuch overreach and corruption. So the early Qing emperors imposed strict limits. No more than 3,000 eunuchs in the palace. Eunuchs banned from political activity. Any eunuch who involved himself in government would be executed. For much of the Qing period, these restrictions held. By the early 20th century, there were only about 2,000 eunuchs in the Forbidden City. But whether there were 2,000 or 70,000, all eunuchs lived under a system that was rigorously hierarchical, brutally strict, and permeated by both opportunity and danger. Let's understand how that system worked. Let's see what daily life looked like for a eunuch, from the lowest servant scrubbing floors to the most powerful officials who whispered in the emperor's ear. Part 4. Hierarchy, Survival, and Daily Existence. The eunuch system was organized with military precision. During the Qing dynasty, eunuchs were divided into 48 specialized departments, each with its own responsibilities, hierarchy, and territory within the palace. This administrative structure created clear chains of command, but it also created opportunities for corruption, infighting, and complex power dynamics. At the bottom were the common eunuchs, sometimes called menial eunuchs. These were the men who did the physical labor that kept the palace functioning. They carried water from wells to wherever it was needed. Water for cooking, for washing, for the decorative ponds and gardens, for the concubines' baths. They carried human waste out of the palace in buckets, a job that had to be done daily for thousands of residents. They maintained the heating systems, burning wood and charcoal in furnaces that fed hot air through clay pipes under the floors. They cleaned, swept, dusted, polished. These common eunuchs lived in small huts or dormitories attached to the buildings where their masters resided. Each courtyard in the Forbidden City had a cluster of these menials' houses, where the eunuchs assigned to that area lived. The accommodations were basic: a sleeping platform, maybe a small chest for possessions, space barely large enough to turn around. Eunuchs would be summoned at any time, day or night, whenever their services were needed. They had to be available constantly. Common eunuchs received the minimum salary, 2 to 4 taels of silver per month. A tael was a traditional Chinese unit of weight, approximately 40 grams of silver, and it served as currency. 2 to 4 taels was enough for basic survival if one lived frugally. It was also much less than what they could make in other ways. Because while official salaries were low, opportunities for unofficial income were everywhere. Eunuchs controlled access and flow within the palace. Everything that came in, food from farmers, silk from merchants, official documents from ministers, passed through eunuch hands. And eunuchs expected a cut. A farmer bringing vegetables to the palace kitchen would give a portion to the eunuch receiving the delivery. A merchant delivering fabric would pay the eunuch handling the transaction. These weren't bribes exactly, or rather they were, but they were also seen as customary tips, expected payments for smoothing the process. Over time, these small cuts could add up. Even low-ranking eunuchs could accumulate savings through these informal payments. The food system was particularly lucrative for eunuchs. The imperial kitchen prepared meals for the emperor, his family, and all the palace residents. The ingredients were supplied through official requisitions, but eunuchs managed the actual procurement and delivery. Eunuchs in the food procurement department could skim ingredients and sell them on the black market. Eunuchs in the kitchen could take portions of prepared food. Eunuchs serving the food could steal leftovers, which weren't really leftovers. The emperor rarely ate more than a few bites of any dish, both for food safety reasons and because dozens of dishes were presented at each meal for the appearance of abundance. Clothing provided another source of income. The emperor's clothes were made new for each wearing and could not be reused by him. After the emperor wore a garment once, it was supposed to be stored or given as gifts, but often eunuchs would take these clothes and sell them. Garments worn by the Son of Heaven were valuable even second-hand. Similar opportunities existed with the empresses' and concubines' clothing. Then there were the gifts and payments from officials seeking imperial audiences. An official arriving from the provinces with a petition for the emperor had to go through layers of eunuchs to actually reach the emperor's presence. At each layer, a payment was expected. Small payments for low-ranking eunuchs who might carry a message. Larger payments for mid-ranking eunuchs who could ensure your petition reached the right office. Substantial bribes for high-ranking eunuchs who had the emperor's ear and could actually influence his decision. This created a strange economy within the Forbidden City. Official salaries were low. Actual income depended on position, access, and willingness to participate in this system of informal payments and bribes. Eunuchs who refused to take bribes were rare and were often seen as foolish by their colleagues. The system was understood and accepted, as long as it didn't become too excessive or too obvious. But let's move up the hierarchy. Above the common eunuchs were supervisors and managers. These were eunuchs who had proven themselves competent and loyal, who had spent years serving without major infractions, who had been promoted to positions of oversight. They managed teams of common eunuchs, ensured tasks were completed properly, and served as intermediaries between the lowest servants and higher authorities. These mid-ranking eunuchs earned better salaries, perhaps 6 to 8 taels per month, and they had more opportunities for informal income. They lived in slightly better accommodations and began to accumulate power within their specific domains. Then came the specialists. Some eunuchs were trained for specific functions. There were eunuch cooks who prepared imperial meals and had to memorize complex recipes and presentation styles. There were eunuch actors and musicians who performed in palace theaters for the entertainment of the emperor and his family. A troupe of 300 eunuch actors was maintained specifically for palace performances because outsiders couldn't enter the inner court. There were eunuch scholars who maintained palace libraries and archives. There were eunuch priests, typically Tibetan Buddhist lamas, who attended to the spiritual needs of the palace women and received double salary for their religious role. And then, at the top of the hierarchy, were the high eunuchs who held positions of real power. These positions had official ranks that corresponded to the broader Chinese bureaucratic system. The highest-ranking eunuch position was typically ranked at the 3rd grade, equivalent to a moderately senior government official. This was the chief eunuch or general supervisor, who oversaw all other eunuchs in the palace. Below the chief eunuch were department superintendents, each managing one of the 48 specialized departments. These men controlled significant resources and had access to the emperor and his family. They could approve or deny requests, facilitate or obstruct official business, and their recommendations carried weight. The most powerful eunuch position of all, however, wasn't defined by official rank, but by personal relationship. The director of ceremonial, especially the brush-holding director of ceremonial, served as the emperor's personal secretary. He would be present when the emperor reviewed official documents and memorials. He would brush-write the emperor's comments and decisions. He would handle confidential communications. And because he was with the emperor constantly, because he knew the emperor's moods and preferences, he could influence decisions in subtle ways. Wei Zhongxian held this position under the Tianqi emperor. It gave him the ability to control what information reached the emperor and what the emperor's responses were. Over time, Wei Zhongxian began issuing edicts in the emperor's name. Officials couldn't tell whether orders came from the emperor himself or from Wei Zhongxian. And since the emperor, who preferred carpentry to governance, rarely contradicted his trusted eunuch, Wei Zhongxian's word became imperial law. But for every Wei Zhongxian who reached the heights of power, there were thousands of eunuchs who lived and died in obscurity, serving in menial positions, struggling to survive the palace's harsh realities. Let's talk about what daily life actually felt like for these men. A typical eunuch's day began before dawn. Eunuchs serving in the inner chambers had to wake before their masters to prepare for the day. Fires needed to be lit, water heated, sleeping chambers tidied. When the emperor or a concubine woke, everything had to be ready. Breakfast was prepared by kitchen eunuchs and served by chamber eunuchs. The emperor might eat at 7 in the morning or 6 in summer. His meal would include a careful selection of dishes chosen for health and balance, though the emperor would typically taste only a few bites from each dish. The rest would disappear into the palace economy, redistributed to other residents or pocketed by eunuchs. After breakfast, eunuchs attended to the daily rituals. The emperor might review memorials from provincial officials, with his brush-holding eunuch standing by. Eunuchs would escort officials arriving for audiences, announce them with proper formality, and remain present during meetings in case the emperor needed anything. Meanwhile, throughout the palace, thousands of other eunuchs were performing their assigned tasks. Eunuchs in the storehouses inventoried supplies. Eunuchs in the gardens pruned trees and maintained decorative plantings. Eunuchs serving concubines helped them dress styled their hair, carried messages, and attended to their endless needs and requests. Everything in the palace happened according to rigid protocol. There were correct ways to address different ranks of people, correct ways to walk through certain courtyards, correct ways to present documents or deliver messages. Eunuchs had to memorize all these protocols. A mistake could result in punishment. And punishments were severe. The Forbidden City maintained strict discipline. Floggings were common for infractions. Empress Dowager Cixi kept a yellow bag filled with bamboo rods, specifically for beating eunuchs. If a eunuch displeased her, she would order palace maids or other eunuchs to beat the offender with these bamboo rods. The beating would continue until she felt sufficient punishment had been delivered, which might mean until the eunuch was unconscious or permanently injured. The last emperor, Puyi, recalled in his autobiography that by age 11, flogging eunuchs was part of his daily routine. Whenever he was in a bad mood, eunuchs suffered. They had no recourse, no way to defend themselves. They were the emperor's property, his slaves in all but name, and he could treat them however he wished. This created a psychology of terror mixed with ambition. Eunuchs lived in constant fear of arbitrary punishment, but they also nurtured hopes of advancement and wealth. The tension between these realities shaped eunuch culture within the palace. Eunuchs formed alliances and factions. They looked out for each other within their groups, but competed ruthlessly across groups. Senior eunuchs accumulated junior followers, creating networks of patronage. A powerful eunuch might adopt younger eunuchs as sons, since eunuchs couldn't have biological children. These adoptions were both emotional bonds and political alliances. An adopted son would be loyal to his adoptive father, would carry out his wishes, would inherit his position and connections when he died. Eunuchs also formed relationships with palace maids and serving women. These relationships were called vegetarian couples, or duishi. In these partnerships, a eunuch and a woman would pledge to support each other, to protect each other, to share resources. They might live together in the eunuch's quarters or maintain separate quarters, but function as a couple. They couldn't have children, and the sexual dimension of these relationships varied. Some were celibate partnerships of convenience, others were romantic and sexual, despite the eunuch's castration. Some eunuchs married women outside the palace, though this was technically against palace rules. The eunuch An Dehai, a favorite of Empress Dowager Cixi, married a 19-year-old woman when he was 24. These external marriages were rare and controversial, but they happened. Despite these relationships, many eunuchs struggled with profound loneliness. They were cut off from their birth families. They couldn't have children. They lived in a world of rigid hierarchy, where genuine friendship was difficult because everyone was either above or below you in rank. They were neither fully men nor women, neither free nor exactly enslaved, neither powerful nor entirely powerless. And then there was the smell. The incontinence problem never went away. Eunuchs lived with the constant embarrassment of soiled clothing, wet bedding, the need for frequent washing and changing. The palace stank of urine because thousands of eunuchs had limited bladder control. This was so pervasive that it became a defining characteristic of eunuchs in popular imagination. The phrase, "as smelly as a eunuch," was a common insult for anyone who stank. Imagine living like this. Imagine the psychological burden of having traded your manhood for security, only to find that security meant servitude, humiliation, and the constant smell of your own body's betrayal. The knowledge that everyone could smell what you were. That your castration wasn't just visible in your face and voice, but announced by your scent. And yet there was always the possibility of rising. The possibility that through cleverness, through making the right alliances, through being in the right place when the emperor needed someone, you could become one of the powerful ones. You could move from the menials' huts to private chambers, from carrying water to controlling treasuries, from being beaten on a whim to being the one whose whims caused officials to tremble. That possibility, however remote, kept ambitious eunuchs striving. And some of them succeeded beyond imagination. Some of them became the most powerful men in China, feared and obeyed even by the emperor himself. Let's meet some of them. Let's understand how eunuchs, these supposedly powerless castrated slaves, became the hidden rulers of the world's largest empire. Part 5. The Hidden Rulers. When eunuchs held the dragon throne. Throughout Chinese history, there emerged eunuchs whose names echo through the centuries, whose power reshaped dynasties, whose actions redirected the course of civilization. Some brought glory and expansion, others brought corruption and collapse. All of them shared one thing. They had traded their manhood for power, and they wielded that power in ways that intact men with families and sons to think about rarely could. Let's start with one of the most remarkable, Zheng He. Born in 1371 in Yunnan province, Zheng He was originally named Ma He. He came from a Muslim family, descended from a long line of Muslim governors in Yunnan. When the Ming dynasty conquered Yunnan in 1381, the 11-year-old Ma He was captured. Following the brutal custom of the time, the young sons of defeated enemies were castrated and impressed into service. Ma He was emasculated and brought to serve in the household of the prince who would later become the Yongle emperor. The relationship between Ma He and the prince, Zhu Di, grew over the years. When Zhu Di fought to claim the throne, Ma He served him loyally in military campaigns. After Zhu Di became the Yongle emperor in 1402, he rewarded the eunuch by giving him the name Zheng He and placing enormous trust in him. What happened next was unprecedented. The Yongle emperor wanted to expand China's influence across maritime Asia and beyond. He wanted to bring distant kingdoms into the Chinese tributary system, to collect exotic goods and animals, and to demonstrate Chinese power to the world. For this mission, he chose Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He commanded 7 massive naval expeditions, known as the treasure voyages. These weren't small missions. Zheng He's fleet, at its largest, included over 300 ships and 30,000 men. The largest vessels, called treasure ships, were over 400 feet long, larger than any European ships of the era. These fleets sailed through Southeast Asia, to India, to Arabia, to Persia, and down the coast of Africa as far as Kenya. Zheng He brought back tribute from dozens of kingdoms, established trade relationships, and transported exotic gifts for the emperor: giraffes from Africa, lions, zebras, precious gems, rare spices. He intervened in local conflicts, installed friendly rulers, and generally projected Chinese power across the Indian Ocean in a way that wouldn't be matched until European colonial expansion centuries later. A castrated man commanded the greatest fleet in the world. A eunuch admiral mapped trade routes and conducted diplomacy that affected 3 continents. When people imagine eunuchs as powerless servants, they're forgetting Zheng He. But if Zheng He represents the glorious possibilities of eunuch power, other eunuchs reveal its darker potential. Let's talk about Wei Zhongxian, the gambling, debt-fleeing man we met earlier, who became the most notorious eunuch in Chinese history. Wei Zhongxian entered palace service around 1605, in his late 30s, already an adult who had voluntarily castrated himself to escape his debts. He was assigned to serve in the household of Lady Wang, a minor concubine who would later give birth to a son, Zhu Youjiao. Wei Zhongxian befriended Zhu Youjiao's wet nurse, Madame Ke, and through her gained the child's trust and affection. When Zhu Youjiao became the Tianqi emperor in 1620 at age 15, Wei Zhongxian's position transformed overnight. The young emperor wasn't interested in governance. He preferred carpentry, spending hours in his workshop designing and building furniture while affairs of state piled up unattended. Wei Zhongxian noticed this opportunity. As the brush-holding director of ceremonial, Wei Zhongxian was present when documents arrived from officials. He would summarize the contents for the emperor, who often just told Wei to handle it. Gradually, Wei Zhongxian stopped asking for approval. He simply issued edicts in the emperor's name. Officials couldn't tell whether orders originated with the emperor or the eunuch, and since the emperor never contradicted Wei Zhongxian, the eunuch's word became law. Wei Zhongxian consolidated power ruthlessly. He created a faction of loyal eunuchs and placed them in key positions throughout the palace administration. He appointed corrupt officials who owed him their positions. He took control of the Eastern Depot, the secret police agency staffed by eunuchs, and used it to identify and eliminate opponents. When a reform-minded group of scholars and officials called the Donglin movement began criticizing palace corruption, Wei Zhongxian moved against them. He had Donglin members arrested, tortured, and executed on fabricated charges. Hundreds of officials were purged. Some were beaten to death in prison. Others committed suicide rather than face prolonged torture. Wei Zhongxian's terror campaign effectively silenced political opposition for years. Meanwhile, Wei Zhongxian enriched himself spectacularly. He took bribes from officials seeking appointments or favors. He skimmed from government revenues. He controlled lucrative monopolies. When local officials tried to curry favor, they built temples honoring Wei Zhongxian, worshipping him like a god. At one point, Wei Zhongxian was referred to as 9,000 years, while the emperor was called 10,000 years, meaning Wei Zhongxian's power was nearly equal to imperial authority itself. Officials competed to flatter him. Some asked to be adopted as his sons, seeking his patronage and protection. Wei Zhongxian adopted dozens of men as sons and nephews, building a vast network of obligated followers. His adopted sons received government appointments, military commands, and access to wealth. For 7 years, from 1620 to 1627, Wei Zhongxian effectively ruled China. The Tianqi emperor remained on the throne, but real power resided with a castrated former gambler who had entered the palace to escape his debts. Then, in 1627, the Tianqi emperor died suddenly, possibly from illness, possibly from an accident in his workshop. His younger brother ascended the throne as the Chongzhen emperor. The new emperor was intelligent, capable, and horrified by Wei Zhongxian's corruption. Within months of taking power, he ordered Wei Zhongxian exiled. On the way to his place of exile, Wei Zhongxian received word that the emperor had ordered his arrest and trial. Knowing what awaited him, Wei Zhongxian hanged himself. The emperor had his corpse dismembered and displayed as a warning. But the damage Wei Zhongxian had done to the Ming dynasty was irreparable. The purge of competent Donglin officials, the corruption that permeated the government, the loss of public trust, all contributed to the Ming's collapse just 17 years later in 1644. One eunuch's rise and fall marked the beginning of a dynasty's end. Wei Zhongxian represents the extreme of eunuch power, but he wasn't alone. Throughout Chinese history, powerful eunuchs shaped events in ways that astounded and horrified their contemporaries. Zhao Gao in the Qin dynasty manipulated the succession after the first emperor's death, installing a puppet ruler and effectively controlling the empire until the Qin collapsed in 206 BC. Wang Zhen, in the mid-15th century Ming dynasty, gained such influence over a young emperor that he was appointed to command a military campaign against Mongol invaders, despite having no military experience. The campaign was a disaster. Wang Zhen's army was destroyed, and the emperor was captured by the Mongols, an incident known as the Tumu Crisis. Wang Zhen himself was killed, but the damage to Ming prestige was enormous. Liu Jin, another Ming eunuch, controlled government from 1505 to 1510 as head of the 8 Tigers, a group of powerful eunuchs. In just 4 years, he accumulated wealth estimated at 15 million pounds of gold. When he was finally executed for treason, his mansion was found to contain treasure that shocked even the imperial court. These men were castrated. They had no testicles, no penis. They couldn't have children. They couldn't found dynasties. And yet they held power that kings would envy. They issued orders that generals obeyed. They accumulated wealth that could buy armies. How? How did this happen? How did a system designed to create powerless servants produce China's most dangerous power brokers? The answer lies in access and isolation. Chinese emperors, particularly in later dynasties, lived in profound isolation. They rarely left the Forbidden City. They saw few people outside their immediate household. The scholar officials who ran the government had access to the emperor only through formal audiences governed by strict protocol. Ministers couldn't just drop by to chat with the emperor. They couldn't build personal relationships with him. They couldn't become his friends. But eunuchs saw the emperor daily. They dressed him, bathed him, served his meals, slept outside his chamber door. They saw him at his most vulnerable, his most human. They knew his moods, his preferences, his fears, his desires. And crucially, if a eunuch had served the emperor since childhood, if they had played together as boys, if the eunuch had been the young prince's companion and confidant, then a bond existed that no amount of Confucian scholarship could compete with. The emperor trusted his childhood eunuch companions in ways he could never trust officials he barely knew, and that trust was power. Additionally, eunuchs controlled information flow. Documents reached the emperor through eunuch intermediaries. Petitions were filtered by eunuchs. Audiences were arranged by eunuchs. If a eunuch wanted to keep information from the emperor, he simply didn't pass it along. If he wanted to emphasize certain information, he could present it at favorable moments and frame it in ways that shaped the emperor's response. And there was no counterbalance. Eunuchs couldn't found dynasties or produce heirs, so they weren't seen as threats to imperial succession. This freed them to accumulate power in ways that intact men couldn't, because intact men with sons were always potential rivals to the throne. But here's the deepest irony, the twist that makes the whole system so tragic and absurd. The eunuch system was created to protect the emperor from threats to his legitimacy and power. Castrated servants couldn't usurp the throne. They couldn't seduce the empress. They couldn't father pretenders to the crown. And yet, by creating a class of men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain, who had sacrificed their futures to serve the present, the system created its own worst threat. Eunuchs didn't need to usurp the throne. They didn't need to found new dynasties. They could simply control the emperor, rule through him, and enjoy all the benefits of power without the burden of the crown. The system designed to protect the emperor made him vulnerable to a different kind of danger. Not the danger of rebellion or usurpation, but the danger of being controlled by the very servants who were supposed to be powerless. This is what dynasties learned, again and again, at terrible cost. Every few generations, powerful eunuchs would rise, would dominate the court, would enrich themselves and their allies while the empire suffered. Emperors would crack down, impose restrictions, reduce eunuch numbers. And then, 1 or 2 generations later, it would happen again. Because the fundamental problem never changed. Emperors needed servants in the inner court. Those servants had to be eunuchs. And some of those eunuchs would always be ambitious, clever, and ruthless enough to exploit their position. But let's not forget, for every powerful eunuch who ruled from the shadows, there were thousands who lived and died in obscurity. Thousands who endured the brutal realities of palace life without ever accumulating wealth or power. Thousands who made the sacrifice, paid the price, and received nothing in return except survival. What was daily life like for these anonymous eunuchs? What were their struggles, their relationships, their small joys and constant sorrows? Let's return to the lived experience of the ordinary eunuch, because this is where the true human story lies. Part 6. The intimacies they could and couldn't have. One of the most profound questions about eunuch life, one that historical sources often dance around but rarely address directly, is the question of intimacy. Sexual intimacy, yes, but also emotional. Intimacy, companionship, love. What did these men, who had sacrificed their reproductive capacity and much of their sexual function, do about the human need for connection? The answer is more complex than you might expect. First, let's dispel a common misconception. Eunuchs were not entirely asexual. Men who were castrated after puberty retained some sexual capacity. They could still experience desire, could still achieve erections in some cases, could still engage in sexual activity, though they couldn't produce semen or father children. The physical mechanics were altered, but not entirely eliminated. This meant that sexual relationships between eunuchs and palace women did occur, though they were officially forbidden and could result in severe punishment if discovered. These relationships couldn't produce children, which from the palace's perspective was their theoretical safety, no risk of illegitimate offspring. But they violated the principle that only the emperor could have sexual access to the women in the inner court. There are hints in historical records of these relationships. The term used was sometimes siexia, which translates as immoral games rather than adultery, reflecting the understanding that without the possibility of conception, these weren't quite the same as the sexual relationships that threatened imperial legitimacy. During the Northern Qi dynasty, Empress Dowager Hu was said to have engaged in such activities with her eunuchs, though historians noted carefully that traditional adultery wasn't possible. More common and more openly acknowledged were the vegetarian couple relationships, duishi or kaehu. In these arrangements, a eunuch and a palace maid would form a partnership that served both practical and emotional needs. They would support each other, share resources, provide companionship. These relationships had the palace's tacit approval because they created stability. Eunuchs and maids who had partners were less likely to cause trouble, less likely to be lonely and desperate, more likely to be emotionally balanced. Some of these vegetarian partnerships were celibate, practical arrangements between people who needed allies in the palace's harsh social environment. Others were romantic and sexual, real relationships built on genuine affection despite the unusual circumstances. And some fell somewhere in between, companionship that occasionally included physical intimacy, but was primarily about emotional connection and mutual support. The palace maid Ma Saihua married the eunuch An Dehai when she was 19 and he was 24. An Dehai was a favorite of Empress Dowager Cixi and held significant power in the later Qing court. Their marriage was unusual but not unique. It represented a pattern that existed throughout eunuch history, the desire for normal relationships despite abnormal circumstances. Eunuchs also formed marriages with women outside the palace, though this was technically forbidden. Rich eunuchs who owned houses in Beijing would sometimes marry women they met through these external connections. These marriages were complex. What could a eunuch offer a wife? Not children, not traditional sexual relationships, but they could offer security, status, connection to power, and in some cases, genuine emotional intimacy. Some women married eunuchs willingly, calculating that the trade-offs were worthwhile. Others were essentially purchased and had little choice. But perhaps the most important relationships in eunuchs' lives were the bonds they formed with other eunuchs. These were the people who understood their situation, who shared their humiliations and hopes, who could relate to the unique psychological burden of being neither fully men nor women, neither fully free nor fully enslaved. Eunuchs formed chosen families through adoption. Since they couldn't have biological children, many eunuchs adopted younger eunuchs as sons. These weren't merely legal formalities. They were emotional bonds. A senior eunuch would take a junior eunuch under his protection, teach him the palace's ways, help him advance, and provide him with emotional support. In return, the adopted son would serve his adoptive father loyally, care for him in old age, and inherit his position and connections when he died. These adoption networks created patronage systems within the palace. A powerful eunuch might have dozens of adopted sons and grandsons, creating a faction that functioned like a family business. When the patriarch died, his eldest adopted son would inherit his position and continue protecting the family's interests. Senior eunuchs also sometimes adopted infant boys from outside the palace, normal, uncastrated boys, and would arrange for them to be castrated and trained for palace service when they reached an appropriate age. This sounds horrific by modern standards, and it was. But from the eunuch's perspective, he was giving an orphan or a desperately poor child a chance at survival and prosperity, the same chance he had received. The emotional landscape of these relationships was complicated. There was genuine affection. There was also exploitation, manipulation, and abuse. A senior eunuch might demand sexual favors from adopted sons or junior eunuchs in exchange for protection and advancement. The power imbalances were severe, and without any legal recourse or appeal, junior eunuchs had to endure whatever their seniors demanded. Some eunuchs found comfort in religion. Buddhism and Taoism both had strong presences in the palace. Some eunuchs became priests, serving as lamas for the spiritual needs of palace women. These eunuch priests received double salary and had a respected status. More importantly, perhaps, religious practice gave them a framework for understanding their suffering, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. But for many eunuchs, the emotional reality was profound loneliness. Cut off from their birth families, many never saw their parents or siblings again after entering the palace. Unable to have children, living in a world of hierarchy and suspicion where genuine friendship was difficult, they experienced isolation that's hard for us to imagine. And always there was the physical reality of their bodies. The incontinence that meant they were constantly damp and stinking. The voice that marked them as different. The smooth face that never grew a proper beard. The knowledge that they had traded their manhood for survival and would carry that trade in their bodies until death. Some eunuchs managed to create meaningful lives despite all this. They found partners, formed families, built relationships based on mutual support and genuine affection. They found dignity in their service, pride in their skills, satisfaction in doing their jobs well. Others were broken by it. They became bitter, cruel, willing to inflict on others the humiliations they endured. They sought power as compensation for what they'd lost, grasping at control over other people's lives because they had so little control over their own. And most probably fell somewhere in between. They survived. They adapted. They found small pleasures where they could. A good meal, a beautiful day in the garden, a joke shared with a colleague, a moment of kindness from someone who saw them as human rather than as a castrated servant. This was the psychological reality of eunuch life. This was what it meant to live in the space between worlds, belonging fully to neither the male nor female realm, neither slave nor free, neither powerless nor empowered. And through it all, through the loneliness and the humiliation and the small joys and the desperate grasping for power, they had to navigate a palace system that could destroy them in an instant if they made a wrong move. Part 7. The physical burden. Living in a castrated body. Let's talk about something the historical records rarely discuss in detail. What it actually felt like. day after day, year after year, to live in a body that had been surgically altered in such a fundamental way. The immediate consequences of castration, the pain, the recovery, the mortality risk, we've already covered. But the long-term physical reality was something eunuchs carried for the rest of their lives. The incontinence problem was perhaps the most socially debilitating. Without proper genital structure, without the muscles and tissues that normally control urination, many eunuchs had limited ability to hold their bladder. They would urinate involuntarily throughout the day and night. They wet their beds. They wet themselves while standing, sitting, performing their duties. For the first several years after castration, this was particularly severe. Young eunuchs would wake in soaked bedding every morning. At first, senior eunuchs and supervisors would overlook it. After all, the body needed time to adjust. But if the problem continued past a reasonable period, the floggings would begin. Eunuchs would be beaten with bamboo rods to train them to control their bladders, as if beatings could somehow compensate for missing anatomical structures. The beatings didn't work, of course. What they did was add humiliation and pain to an already unbearable situation. Imagine being beaten for something you couldn't control, something that resulted directly from a choice that had been made for you or forced on you by poverty. Eventually, most eunuchs developed some degree of adaptation. They learned to urinate at regular intervals before their bladders became full. They wore multiple layers of undergarments that could absorb some accidents. They changed clothes frequently. They washed constantly. But they could never entirely escape the problem. And the smell. The Forbidden City's pervasive urine smell was notorious. Visitors commented on it. The Chinese expression, "as smelly as a eunuch," was a common insult. The smell marked eunuchs as clearly as their high voices or smooth faces. It announced what they were before anyone saw them. This had profound psychological effects. Eunuchs knew they stank. They knew everyone could smell them. They knew this smell was the constant reminder of their castration, the olfactory evidence of their altered state. Some eunuchs became obsessive about cleanliness, washing themselves and their clothes multiple times per day, burning incense, using perfumes and powders. But nothing could entirely mask the smell. The hormonal changes also affected their bodies in ways that became more pronounced over the years. Without testosterone, eunuchs' muscle mass decreased. They tended toward a more feminine body fat distribution, with fat accumulating around the hips and thighs rather than the abdomen. Many developed slight breast tissue. Their skin remained smooth, without the coarseness that testosterone produces. They didn't go bald. Eunuchs kept their hair throughout their lives, which was actually considered one of the few benefits of castration. But the bone changes were more problematic. Some medical studies of eunuch remains have found bone abnormalities consistent with hormone deficiency. Without testosterone, bones could become weaker, more prone to fractures. Growth plates sometimes failed to close properly, leading to unusual height and body proportions. Some eunuchs grew quite tall, well over 6 feet, because their leg bones kept growing longer than normal. The voice changes were permanent and distinctive. Eunuchs spoke in high-pitched tones that immediately identified them. This wasn't quite like a woman's voice or a child's voice. It was a unique sound, described in Chinese sources as piercing or penetrating. When eunuchs were angry or upset, their high-pitched shouting could be particularly unnerving. And then there were the health problems that developed over time. The operation itself often left complications. Scar tissue could cause chronic pain. Urinary tract infections were common because of the anatomical changes. Some eunuchs developed kidney problems from repeated infections. Others suffered from ongoing issues with the surgical site, tissue that didn't heal properly, adhesions that caused discomfort, keloid scarring. Sexual dysfunction was obviously a given, but the details were more complex than simply being unable to have intercourse. Some eunuchs retained partial sexual function, which meant they could experience desire but had limited ability to satisfy it. This could be psychologically torturous, to feel sexual attraction, to want physical intimacy, but to lack the equipment for it. Other eunuchs reported feeling nothing, no sexual desire at all, which they sometimes described as a kind of peace. Without testosterone driving sexual urges, without the distraction of sexual thoughts, they could focus entirely on advancement and survival. Some eunuchs wrote that this was actually a benefit of castration. It freed them from desires that couldn't be satisfied anyway. The psychological effects are harder to document because historical records rarely include eunuchs' own accounts of their mental states. But we can infer from behavior patterns and from the few eunuch writings that exist. Depression must have been common. Many eunuchs had been castrated as children before they could fully understand what they were losing. As they matured and saw intact men around them, as they understood that they could never have families, never pass on their names, never experience much of what society considered normal adult life, the psychological weight must have been crushing for some. Anger and resentment surface in historical accounts. Eunuchs were often described as vindictive, as nursing grudges, as taking revenge for slights in disproportionate ways. This makes psychological sense. When you've suffered an irreversible injustice, when you've been mutilated and humiliated, rage is a natural response. And for eunuchs who gained power, that rage could become dangerous. They had the means to hurt others the way they'd been hurt, and some of them used it. But there were also eunuchs who found peace, who accepted their situation and made the best of it. The eunuch Zheng He, who served faithfully under 3 Ming emperors from 1563 to 1605, was remembered as honest, loyal, and kind. He never sought power beyond his position. He never accumulated excessive wealth. When he died, he was given the rare honor of burial near the Ming tombs, a reward for decades of faithful service. Zheng He's tomb still exists, one of the few eunuch tombs that has been preserved. It's become a kind of memorial to all eunuchs, a place where people can contemplate this strange institution and the men who lived within it. But for every Zheng He who found dignity in service, there were probably dozens of eunuchs who lived in quiet desperation, doing their jobs, surviving day to day, without ever achieving wealth or power or even basic contentment. And then there were the eunuchs who served during the worst times, who witnessed the collapse of order, who saw the system that had consumed their manhood fall apart before their eyes. Eunuchs like those who served the last emperor, Puyi. Part 8. The Final Dynasty. Life under the last emperor. By the time Puyi ascended the throne in 1908 at age 2, the Qing dynasty was already dying. The empire had suffered defeats in the Opium Wars, lost territory to European powers and Japan, and faced internal rebellions that nearly toppled it. The 1911 revolution would force Puyi's abdication within 4 years of his coronation. But under the Articles of Favorable Treatment, Puyi was allowed to continue living in the Forbidden City with his title and a stipend, maintaining the illusion of imperial stardom while the new Republic of China governed outside the palace walls. For the eunuchs serving Puyi, this created a strange twilight existence. They served an emperor who wasn't really an emperor. They maintained rituals and ceremonies for a dynasty that had ended. They lived in a palace that had become a kind of museum, a relic of a vanished world preserved by political compromise. And they served, increasingly, a cruel and capricious master. Puyi's autobiography, From Emperor to Citizen, written decades later after his communist re-education, includes disturbing passages about his treatment of eunuchs. He recalled that by age 11, flogging eunuchs was part of his daily routine. Whenever he was in a bad mood, the eunuchs suffered. They became the targets of a powerless child emperor's frustration. Puyi once planned to feed a eunuch a cake filled with iron filings just to see what would happen. He was only talked out of it by his wet nurse, who was one of the few people he genuinely loved and who could influence his behavior. This level of casual cruelty reveals how utterly powerless eunuchs were. They couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't refuse orders. They couldn't even complain. They existed at the absolute mercy of an increasingly disturbed young man who had no outlet for his rage except them. But the eunuchs also took advantage of Puyi's youth and inexperience. The palace during Puyi's adolescence and early adulthood became increasingly corrupt. Eunuchs stole systematically from the imperial treasuries. Art objects disappeared and were sold on the black market. Precious antiques vanished. Jade pieces, ancient scrolls, historical relics, all were looted by eunuchs who knew the dynasty was ending and wanted to secure their futures. Puyi's English tutor, Reginald Johnston, encouraged the young emperor to modernize and to crack down on eunuch corruption. In 1923, Puyi ordered an inventory of the Forbidden City's treasures. The eunuchs panicked. On the night of June 26, 1923, the Hall of Established Happiness caught fire. The official story was that it was accidental. The reality was almost certainly arson. Eunuchs covering up theft by destroying the evidence. When Johnston and Puyi inspected the ruins the next day, they found the young emperor and his wife standing on a pile of charred wood, looking at what had been destroyed. The official inventory listed 2,085 golden Buddha statues, 1,675 golden altar ornaments, 435 porcelain antiques, and 31 boxes of sable furs as lost in the fire. But everyone knew most of these items had been stolen long before the fire. The flames had just destroyed the records that would have proven the theft. Puyi finally decided he'd had enough. He ordered the expulsion of all eunuchs from the Forbidden City. The dowager consorts, the widows of previous emperors who still lived in the palace, protested. They claimed they couldn't function without eunuch servants. Puyi compromised by allowing 50 eunuchs to remain to serve the dowagers, but the rest, about 1,500 men, were expelled. Imagine that scene. Imagine being a eunuch who had served in the palace for decades, who had known no other life, who had nowhere else to go. You're given a few hours to pack your possessions. You're forced out through the gates into a Beijing that has changed beyond recognition since you entered the palace. You have no family. They're probably dead or have forgotten you. You have no trade except palace service. You have a bag containing your severed genitals and whatever possessions you could carry. One observer described the expelled eunuchs carrying their belongings in sacks and crying piteously in high-pitched voices. That image captures the pathos perfectly. Old men, castrated decades earlier, weeping in their distinctive high voices as they were ejected from the only home they knew. Many of these expelled eunuchs ended up destitute. Some became beggars. Some found work in the houses of wealthy families. There were still aristocrats who employed eunuchs as a status symbol. Some simply disappeared into Beijing's slums and died in obscurity. But then, just a year later in 1924, came an even more dramatic ending. The warlord Feng Yuxiang staged a coup in Beijing. He decided that maintaining the fiction of Puyi's imperial status was politically untenable. On November 5th, 1924, Feng's soldiers surrounded the Forbidden City. Puyi was given 3 hours to leave. His imperial title was abolished. The articles of favorable treatment were revoked. The last emperor of China was now a private citizen with no more rights than any other Chinese person. The remaining eunuchs were expelled along with Puyi. The Forbidden City was turned over to the new republic. An era that had lasted over 2,000 years, from the Qin dynasty to the Qing, ended that day. The system of imperial power, with its eunuchs and concubines and elaborate rituals, vanished. Most of the expelled eunuchs faced grim futures. The new republic had no use for them. They were relics of the feudal past, symbols of the old system the revolution had overthrown. They were often mocked and scorned. The younger eunuchs, those who had been castrated relatively recently, might find menial work. But the older eunuchs, men in their 60s or 70s who had spent their entire adult lives in palace service, had almost no options. Some committed suicide. Historical accounts mention eunuchs drowning themselves in the moats surrounding the Forbidden City, choosing death over the humiliation and poverty that awaited them outside. But one eunuch's story has been preserved in remarkable detail, and it's worth telling because it shows us what became of these men. His name was Sun Yaoting, and he was the last imperial eunuch of China. Part 9. Sun Yaoting, the last eunuch's tale. Sun Yaoting was born in 1902 in a poor farming village in Hebei province. His family struggled with grinding poverty. When Sun was 8 years old, his parents made a decision that would define his entire life. They would have him castrated and send him to serve in the Forbidden City, hoping he might achieve security and prosperity that were impossible on the farm. In late 1911, Sun Yaoting underwent the operation. The procedure by this point was refined by centuries of practice. The surgeon made his cuts. Sun survived the recovery. He was now a eunuch, ready to enter palace service. But timing is everything, and Sun Yaoting's timing was catastrophic. Just weeks after his castration, the Xinhai Revolution erupted. By February 1912, the Qing dynasty had fallen. Puyi abdicated. The need for new eunuchs disappeared overnight. Imagine Sun's father's reaction. He had just had his 8-year-old son castrated, had sacrificed the boy's manhood for a chance at palace employment. And now, weeks later, the dynasty was gone. The palace was closing to new eunuchs. The boy had suffered for nothing. Historical accounts describe Sun's father beating his chest and weeping. "Our boy has suffered for nothing. They don't need eunuchs anymore." Sun Yaoting's early years were difficult. He didn't enter the Forbidden City until later, when he was briefly employed to serve some of the remaining imperial consorts. He had some contact with the palace world, enough to experience what he'd been mutilated to achieve, but his service was limited and ended when the remaining imperial family was expelled in 1924. After 1924, Sun lived as best he could. He was a castrated man in a world that no longer had any use for eunuchs. He faced stigma and mockery. People treated eunuchs as freaks, as remnants of the feudal past that progressive Chinese wanted to forget. When the communists came to power in 1949, life became even more difficult for surviving eunuchs. The Communist Party viewed them as symbols of feudal oppression, as victims of the old imperial system who had been exploited and mutilated. But this theoretical sympathy didn't translate into practical help. Eunuchs were denied many opportunities because of their connection to the old regime. Sun Yaoting eventually found work as a caretaker at a Buddhist temple in Beijing. It was humble work, but it provided shelter and basic income. He lived quietly, survived the tumultuous decades of civil war and communist consolidation. But then came the Cultural Revolution in 1966. This was a period of intense political persecution, when anything connected to traditional Chinese culture was attacked as reactionary. Old books were burned, temples destroyed, traditional practices condemned, and former imperial servants became targets. Sun Yaoting faced real danger. Red Guards attacked anything connected to the old imperial system. Former palace servants were paraded in struggle sessions, forced to wear dunce caps and signs proclaiming their crimes. Some were beaten, some were killed. Sun's family, terrified that possession of his preserved Bao would mark them as harboring imperial relics, destroyed it. The genitals Sun had carried with him for over 50 years, the treasure he needed to be buried whole in the afterlife, were thrown away in panic. This was perhaps the final indignity. Sun had been castrated as a child based on his parents' decision. He'd suffered because of timing, because the dynasty fell just after his operation. He'd endured decades of stigma and poverty. And now, in his 60s, he lost the preserved parts of his body that Chinese tradition said he needed for a proper afterlife. But Sun survived. The Cultural Revolution eventually ended. China began to modernize and open up, and something unexpected happened. Sun Yaoting became valuable as a source of historical information. He was the last surviving imperial eunuch. He was the last person alive who had actually experienced the palace system from the inside, who could speak from personal knowledge about what life as a eunuch had been like. Historians and journalists sought him out. They interviewed him extensively. His memories became historical documents. In his final years, Sun achieved a kind of recognition he'd never had before. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, but he was respected as a living link to a vanished world. He gave interviews, he shared his stories. He helped scholars understand an institution that had shaped Chinese history for millennia. Sun Yaoting died on December 17, 1996, at age 93 in his home in a Beijing temple. He was the last imperial eunuch of China. With his death, a direct connection to the palace system was severed. No one alive today has experienced what Sun experienced. No one alive today can speak from personal knowledge about what it meant to be a eunuch in the Forbidden City. Sun's story encapsulates the eunuch experience in many ways. The poverty that drove the decision, the operation performed on a child too young to consent, the suffering that came from unfortunate timing, the decades of trying to survive in a world that didn't want you, the loss of the Bao that was supposed to make you whole in death. And finally, in the very end, a measure of dignity and recognition. But Sun's story also reveals what has been lost. When he died, the memories died with him. The texture of daily life as a eunuch, the small details that don't make it into historical records, the personal relationships and private thoughts, all gone. What remains are documents, artifacts, historical accounts written by outsiders. The voices of the eunuchs themselves are largely silent. They were mostly illiterate. Few wrote memoirs. Those who did write often did so under political pressure, in contexts where they couldn't speak freely. So we're left reconstructing their lives from fragments, from official records that document their numbers and duties, but not their feelings. From outsiders' observations that sometimes border on gossip. From archaeological evidence, eunuch tombs, preserved objects, architectural remains. From later interviews with people like Sun Yaoting, whose memories were filtered through decades and through the political contexts in which they spoke. And what emerges from these fragments is a picture of a system that was brutal, complex, sometimes tragic, sometimes darkly absurd, and utterly unique in human history. Let's step back now and try to understand what this all means. What can we learn from the eunuch system? What does it tell us about power, about desperation, about the human capacity to adapt to almost anything? Part 10. Understanding the system. Power, desperation, and irony. The eunuch system of imperial China operated for over 2,000 years. It survived dynasty after dynasty. It persisted despite repeated attempts to limit or eliminate it. It endured because it solved a problem. But in solving that problem, it created new problems that were sometimes worse than the original. Let's trace the logic. The emperor needed male heirs to continue his dynasty. Confucian philosophy demanded that these heirs be legitimate, that their paternity be unquestionable. The emperor therefore needed a harem where he could father multiple children to ensure some would survive the high infant mortality rates of pre-modern times. But a harem full of women needed servants. And if those servants were intact men, the risk of illegitimate children arose. A false heir would disrupt the entire cosmic order, would perform rituals for ancestors who weren't actually his ancestors, would potentially give power to rival families. So the solution was eunuchs, castrated men who couldn't father children, who could move through the women's quarters without threatening the purity of the bloodline. But castration created a class of men who had nothing to lose. They couldn't found dynasties. They couldn't pass on their names through sons. Their biological futures were already dead. This made them, paradoxically, both perfectly safe and uniquely dangerous. Safe because they couldn't usurp the throne or create rival bloodlines. Dangerous because they had no stake in the existing order beyond their own advancement. An intact minister had sons to think about, a family name to protect, a legacy to consider. These concerns created caution. A minister might hesitate before plotting against the emperor because failure would mean not just his death but his entire family's destruction and his name's dishonor. But a eunuch? A eunuch had no descendants to worry about. If he gained power and then fell, he died without heirs anyway. So why not take the risk? Why not grab power while you could? Accumulate wealth while it was possible, enjoy what life offered before it ended. This psychology, repeated across thousands of eunuchs over thousands of years, created a pattern. Most eunuchs remained powerless, but some became spectacularly powerful, willing to take risks that intact men avoided, willing to push boundaries that others respected, willing to sacrifice the dynasty's future for their own present gain. And emperors couldn't effectively control this. They needed eunuchs in the inner court. The entire system of imperial succession and legitimacy required keeping intact men away from the emperor's women. But the very structure that protected legitimacy created opportunities for eunuchs to dominate emperors who were isolated, who saw few people, who trusted childhood companions more than state ministers. This is the central irony. The system designed to protect the emperor made him vulnerable. But there's a second layer of irony here, one that's even darker. The eunuch system was also about class and desperation. Who became eunuchs? Poor boys whose families saw no other option. Orphans. Prisoners. Men fleeing debt or criminal punishment. The desperate and the powerless. These were men society had already failed. And then society mutilated them, marked them permanently as less than whole, and put them in positions where some could gain enormous power. So occasionally, a castrated former gambler like Wei Zhongxian would end up ruling China. A captured Muslim boy like Zheng He would command the world's greatest fleet. A eunuch whose name we don't even know would accumulate more wealth than most princes. The system was designed by the elite to serve the elite's needs. But it created pathways for social mobility that existed nowhere else in Chinese society. A peasant's son had almost zero chance of passing the imperial examinations and becoming a minister. But that same peasant's son, if castrated and lucky and clever, might become one of the most powerful men in China. This doesn't make the system any less horrific. The price was mutilation, humiliation, and suffering. Most eunuchs gained nothing, but the possibility existed, and that possibility drove thousands of desperate men and families to make the choice. And what about the victims? Let's be clear, the eunuchs were victims. Most were castrated as children with no real choice. Even adults who chose castration often did so under economic duress so severe that calling it a choice is questionable. They suffered lifelong physical and psychological consequences. They lived with incontinence, hormonal abnormalities, social stigma, and the knowledge that they'd been permanently altered for others' convenience. But some of these victims became victimizers. Some eunuchs who had suffered enormously inflicted suffering on others. Wei Zhongxian ordered the torture and execution of hundreds. Powerful eunuchs in various dynasties were cruel to their subordinates, corrupt in their dealings, willing to sacrifice millions of ordinary people for their own advantage. This is uncomfortable to acknowledge because we want simple narratives. We want victims to be purely sympathetic. But human nature is more complex. People who have been hurt sometimes hurt others. People who have been powerless sometimes abuse power when they gain it. This doesn't excuse their actions, but it explains them. The eunuch system brought out both the best and worst in human nature. It produced Zheng He, the great explorer. It produced Tian Yi, the loyal servant. It produced Kai Lun, who reportedly invented paper and gave humanity one of its most important technologies. But it also produced Wei Zhongxian, Zhao Gao, and countless other corrupt officials who enriched themselves while dynasties crumbled. And for every famous eunuch, good or bad, there were tens of thousands whose names are lost, who lived their lives in servitude, who suffered without gaining anything in return. The abolition of the system in 1924 was unquestionably correct. No society should mutilate children for economic or political convenience. The eunuch system was a profound violation of human dignity and bodily autonomy. But its abolition came too late for men like Sun Yaoting, who was castrated just before the dynasty fell, and who lived his entire life marked by a decision made when he was 8 years old. In 1999, a eunuch museum opened near Beijing, located next to the tomb of the Ming eunuch Tian Yi. The museum displays artifacts from eunuch life, clothing, tools, documents, photographs. It exists to help people understand this strange institution and the men who lived within it. But perhaps the museum's most important function is to make us uncomfortable. To force us to confront a system that was rational from one perspective. It did solve the problem of imperial succession, but horrific from another. To make us think about the human cost of political systems, about who pays the price for others' security and power. The eunuch system shows us something fundamental about humans. We are capable of extraordinary adaptation. Humans adapted to being castrated, to living with the physical and psychological consequences, to building lives in circumstances that seem unbearable. This speaks to human resilience, but it also shows us human cruelty. We created systems that mutilated children. We accepted these systems for thousands of years. We built elaborate justifications for them, and we benefited from them while others paid the price. Both truths matter, the resilience and the cruelty, the victims and the victimizers, the tragedy and the occasional triumph. Conclusion. The final reveal. Everything was backwards. Let's return one last time to where we began, to the room where boys became eunuchs, to the knife and the blood and the desperate families. But now, after everything we've learned, I want you to see it differently. Close your eyes again. Imagine you're not the 10-year-old boy this time. Imagine you're the Emperor of China. You're the Son of Heaven. You have absolute power over the world's largest empire. You have millions of subjects, countless treasures, and armies that stretch across continents. But you have one problem that terrifies you. How do you ensure your sons are actually your sons? Because if they're not, if a concubine has been sleeping with someone else, then the entire cosmic order collapses. A false heir would perform rituals for ancestors who weren't his ancestors. The mandate of heaven would be violated. The dynasty would fall. So you need servants in the women's quarters. Thousands of servants to attend to hundreds of concubines. But these servants can't be normal men. Normal men might seduce your women, might father children who look like yours, might create rival bloodlines. You need men who physically cannot threaten your lineage, men who cannot father children. You need eunuchs, so you create a system. You allow desperate families to castrate their sons. You provide employment, security, a path out of poverty in exchange for their manhood. It's brilliant. It solves your problem perfectly. Your bloodline is protected. Your dynasty is secure. Except you've just done something that will haunt every Chinese emperor for the next 2,000 years. Something that will ultimately contribute to the fall of dynasty after dynasty. Something so catastrophically counterproductive that future historians will struggle to understand how anyone thought it was a good idea. You've created a class of men who have nothing to lose. Think about it. Really think about it. Every other man in your empire, every minister, every general, every scholar, every merchant, they all have something to lose. They have families. They have sons who will inherit their names. They have legacies to protect. They have futures that extend beyond their own lives. These concerns make men cautious. A minister might want to betray you, but he thinks about his sons, about his family name, about 7 generations of ancestors and 7 generations of descendants. If he fails, everyone pays the price. His entire lineage is destroyed, his name dishonored forever. This is your safety. This is what makes intact men controllable. The threat to their futures keeps them in line. But eunuchs have no sons, no legacies, no futures beyond their own lives. If they gain power and then fall, they die without heirs anyway. There's no family to punish, no descendants to dishonor, nothing to lose except a life that's already been ruined. So why not take the risk? Why not grab power while you can? Why not accumulate wealth, eliminate rivals, even control emperors if the opportunity arises? After all, you're already castrated. You've already paid the highest price. What more can they take from you? And here's the part that makes this tragedy perfect. You, the emperor, gave them access. You put them in your innermost chambers. You let them see you at your most vulnerable. You trusted them with your children because you thought castration made them safe. But castration didn't make them safe. It made them dangerous. It removed the very thing that made other men controllable, the fear for their families' futures. Do you see it now? Do you see how catastrophically backwards this system was? Every emperor created the eunuch system to protect himself from ambitious men. And every emperor, by creating that system, put the most ambitious and dangerous men directly beside him, with nothing to restrain them except the possibility of failure, a possibility that meant nothing to men who had already lost everything that mattered. Wei Zhongxian ruled China for 7 years because the emperor who could have stopped him was too weak, too distracted, too isolated. And why was the emperor isolated? Because the eunuch system had created a palace where eunuchs controlled all access, all information, all contact with the outside world. Zhao Gao manipulated the succession and destroyed the Qin dynasty because he could. Because when the emperor died, a castrated man who had nothing to lose saw an opportunity and took it. Countless eunuchs throughout history accumulated fortunes, eliminated rivals, and corrupted administrations because the system put them in positions of power while removing any long-term consequences that might have restrained them. The system meant to protect the emperor created his greatest threat. This isn't just historical irony. This is a fundamental lesson about how humans create systems. We identify a problem, We design a solution. We implement it. And often, so often, the solution creates worse problems than the original. The emperors saw a problem. How do we staff the women's quarters without risking the bloodline? They created a solution. Castrate the servants so they can't father children. And the solution created a new problem. Now you have thousands of mutilated men with access to power and nothing to lose. But here's what makes this story truly tragic. Here's what should haunt us as we close this chapter of history. The emperors never learned. For 2,000 years, dynasty after dynasty, reign after reign, powerful eunuchs rose and fell. Every time, emperors tried to limit their power. New rules, fewer eunuchs, restrictions on their activities. But the fundamental system remained because the fundamental problem remained. Someone had to staff the inner court, and that someone couldn't be intact men. The system persisted until the very end. Until 1924, when the last emperor was expelled and the need for eunuchs finally disappeared. And what happened to the eunuchs when it ended? Most died in poverty. Some committed suicide. A few survived long enough to tell their stories to historians who realized, too late, that an entire world was vanishing. Sun Yaoting, the last eunuch, said something in his final years that captures this perfectly. When asked if he regretted becoming a eunuch, he said that given his family's circumstances, it was the right choice at the time, the best of terrible options. And then he added, "But no child should ever be put in a position where such a choice has to be made." That's the final lesson. Not just that the system was flawed or tragic or ironic, but that it reveals something fundamental about how societies fail the vulnerable, then use that failure to create systems that ultimately harm everyone, even those the systems were meant to protect. The emperors thought they were protecting their bloodlines. They were actually ensuring that ambitious, desperate, dangerous men would have their ears, would control their access to information, would shape their understanding of the world, and would sometimes rule in their place. The eunuchs thought they were trading their manhood for security. Most gained neither security nor power. They gained only suffering and the permanent mark of their mutilation. The families thought they were saving their sons from starvation. They were condemning them to lives of humiliation, incontinence, and stigma, lives that, for most, never brought the wealth and power they'd hoped for. Everyone in this system was trying to solve a problem. Everyone made rational choices given their circumstances, and the result was 2,000 years of suffering, corruption, and dynastic collapse. That's what we need to remember when we walk through the Forbidden City today. When tourists take photos in the courtyards where eunuchs once lived and died. When we marvel at the architecture and the treasures and the elaborate ceremonies. Behind it all were boys screaming in a room where surgeons held knives, were men who smelled of urine and could never escape that smell, were desperate families making impossible choices, were emperors isolating themselves for safety while putting danger at their very sides. The Forbidden City still stands. The eunuchs are gone. The last of them died nearly 30 years ago. But the lessons remain. About systems that create the problems they're meant to solve. About desperate people becoming dangerous people. About how protecting yourself sometimes means surrounding yourself with those who have nothing to lose. About how solutions can be worse than problems. How good intentions create terrible outcomes. And how 2,000 years isn't long enough for humans to learn from their mistakes. The eunuch's story is over, but the pattern repeats. Different systems, different sacrifices, different victims. The same failure to see that when you take everything from people, you create people who will take everything they can. That's the true story of the eunuchs. That's what the Forbidden City wants to hide behind its crimson walls and golden roofs. That's what we need to remember. If you found this journey meaningful, if these voices from the past resonated, if you're thinking differently now about power and desperation and the systems we create, please like this video and subscribe. History has so many stories that recontextualize what we think we know. So many lessons hidden in places we thought we understood. Join me as we continue uncovering them. Until next time, sleep well. And remember, history isn't just about dates and dynasties. It's about systems and the people caught inside them. About choices that aren't choices. About solutions that become problems. Always, always, it's about what humans do when we're desperate enough to believe that cutting off a 10-year-old's genitals is someone's best option for survival. The Forbidden City remembers. We should too.